At 7:35 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the waters off Juno Beach were dark and cold. Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada crouched in a landing craft, gripping his rifle tightly as waves rocked the vessel. Ahead, the German fortifications loomed. Martin, a 25-year-old from Cooksville, Ontario, had trained for 4 years in England, rising through the ranks from rifleman to one of the youngest company sergeant majors in the regiment's history. Around him were soldiers from every corner of Ontario, farmers, factory workers, clerks, and tradesmen. Most had never fired a shot in anger. Most had never been anywhere near a battlefield. They knew what awaited them. 14,000 Canadian troops were scheduled to storm Juno Beach that morning, and intelligence predicted heavy casualties. Memories of the 1942 Dieppe raid, where over 3,000 Canadians were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day, still haunted the soldiers and their commanders. The Germans had spent 3 years fortifying the coastline, building concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and laying miles of barbed wire and mines. Every square meter of the beach had been prepared to stop an invading army. The preliminary naval bombardment had barely touched the defenses. Only about 14% of German positions were destroyed. General Dwight Eisenhower had approved the assault months earlier, fully aware of the dangers. Juno Beach, positioned between the British Gold and Sword Beaches, was one of the most heavily defended parts of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Even Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, inspecting the Canadian units in March 1944, doubted their readiness, though he could see their determination. Yet he assigned them the task. Someone had to take it. Major General Rodney Keller commanded the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, a mix of soldiers from every province. They had trained relentlessly for 4 years, practicing amphibious assaults, working with tanks, and learning how to coordinate infantry, artillery, and armor. The planning was meticulous. Every detail had been considered, every contingency rehearsed. Still, the landing was terrifying. As the landing craft drew closer, German 75mm guns opened fire, striking the vessels with deadly accuracy. Mines exploded around them, tossing men into the sea. Roughly 30% of the landing craft at Juno were destroyed or badly damaged before reaching shore. The first Canadians to hit the water were met with a wall of bullets. Soldiers fell in groups as they waded through chest-deep water toward the seawall. The Queen's Own Rifles and other regiments took massive losses in minutes. Half the men in some companies were killed or wounded almost immediately. Yet, despite the chaos and carnage, they pressed forward. Martin's landing craft touched the sand at 7:55 a.m. As the ramp dropped, machine gun fire raked the beach. But Martin and his men pushed ahead. They fought through the water, climbed over obstacles, and scrambled into cover behind whatever they could find: rocks, debris, craters. Every movement was a fight for life. The preliminary bombardment had failed to break the German defenses, but the Canadians had learned from past failures. They knew how to survive and advance, and they were determined not to repeat Dieppe. By 9:15 a.m., Martin led his men through a gap in the seawall. The battle became close and personal, house to house, street by street. German defenders fought from windows, doorways, and bunkers, using every advantage of terrain and preparation. The Canadians used grenades and concentrated rifle fire to suppress positions. Explosives cleared walls, allowing soldiers to move from room to room without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The fighting was brutal and methodical, but the Canadians adapted quickly. By 10 a.m., the Queen's Own Rifles had secured the eastern section of Bernier-sur-Mer. To the west, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifle Regiment fought similar battles, clearing fortified streets and capturing German strongpoints.
Tanks from the 1st Hussars and Fort Garry Horse regiments supported them, firing over open sights, destroying bunkers, and helping infantry move forward. By mid-morning, the Canadians were pushing inland past the initial beach defenses. At 11:40 a.m., the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade landed as a reserve force. Brigadier Douglas Cunningham immediately ordered them forward. Soldiers moved in combined columns of infantry and armor, bypassing resistance where possible, engaging German units only when necessary. The speed of their advance stunned the enemy. German 21st Panzer divisions prepared to counterattack, expected to find exhausted Canadians struggling to establish a beachhead. Instead, they met organized, determined forces already 8 to 12 kilometers inland, faster and deeper than any other Allied division on D-Day. This achievement was the result of meticulous preparation, careful planning, and lessons learned from the costly Dieppe raid. Every Canadian soldier knew their role, every officer understood the plan, and every unit had drilled together until their actions became instinctive. They used training, courage, and coordination to overcome overwhelming fire, and they did not falter. By 1 p.m., the Sherbrooke Fusiliers reached key roads and objectives that Allied planners had hoped to secure by nightfall. By early afternoon, the Canadians had exceeded all expectations. Their success was historically significant. The Americans at Omaha Beach fought bravely, but advanced less than 2 kilometers that day. The British at Gold and Sword Beaches pushed steadily but cautiously. The Canadians, however, moved quickly, captured towns, cleared streets, and held strategic positions far inland. They demonstrated that preparation, training, and determination could overcome even the most formidable defenses. By the end of June 6, 1944, Juno Beach had been taken. German resistance had been broken, and Canadian forces had established a strong foothold for further operations inland. Their courage and discipline had not only ensured success, but had rewritten expectations. For the first time, a Canadian force on D-Day had not only met but dramatically exceeded all expectations, securing a place in history for their extraordinary performance, proving that determination, planning, and coordination could achieve the impossible.
On D-Day, June 6, 1944, British forces at Gold and Sword Beaches pushed 5 to 6 kilometers inland, making steady progress against German defenses. The Canadians at Juno Beach went even further, advancing 10 to 12 kilometers into France, the deepest penetration achieved by any Allied forces that day. Their rapid movement, however, created new problems. The fast Canadian advance left a gap between their eastern flank and the British troops moving in from Sword Beach. German commanders noticed immediately and saw a chance to exploit the opening. General Edgar Fittinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, quickly organized a counterattack. His division included 75 tanks and supporting infantry, and at around 4 p.m. they moved to strike through the gap. The Canadians and their British allies faced the German armor with limited anti-tank support. For 4 long hours, the line held under intense fighting, resisting repeated German assaults. Then, at 8 p.m., a massive formation of Allied gliders flew overhead, bringing reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne Division. Observing the overwhelming Allied air presence, Fittinger realized that the Germans could not succeed and ordered a withdrawal. The counterattack collapsed. By the end of June 6th, the Canadians had accomplished what few expected. They had secured all their beach objectives, cleared 4 coastal towns, advanced 12 kilometers inland, and linked up with British units on both flanks. The cost was heavy. 340 Canadians were killed, 574 wounded, and 47 captured.
Yet, despite these losses, the mission succeeded far beyond projections. British historian John Keegan later wrote that by nightfall, Canadian forward units were deeper into France than any other Allied division. The opposition they faced was the strongest of any beach except Omaha, making their accomplishment even more remarkable. Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin survived the brutal D-Day fighting. He continued through Normandy, earning the Distinguished Conduct Medal for bravery following the landing at Juno Beach. In March 1945, during an attack in Germany, he earned the Military Medal. After the war, he returned to Cooksville, Ontario, where he and his wife ran a post office and general store while he worked for the Ontario Department of Agriculture. Martin stayed active in his community, serving as a school trustee and volunteer. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, he published a memoir, Battle Diary, which remains one of the most vivid accounts of ordinary Canadian soldiers in the war. Martin passed away in October 1997, and in recognition of his service, Mrs. Sorga named a trail after him and erected the Charlie Martin Memorial. The German army immediately took note of the Canadians' performance. Intelligence reports from June 7th described the Canadian advance as unexpectedly aggressive and professionally executed. German commanders who had dismissed the Canadians as inexperienced colonials were forced to reassess. Reports from the 716th Infantry Division praised Canadian infantry for their excellent small unit tactics, effective use of armor support, and remarkable adaptability on the battlefield. One German officer even noted that Canadians fought with an intensity he had not seen since the Eastern Front. Allied command, however, was slower to recognize the Canadians' achievements. While Montgomery praised the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in official reports, he privately admitted surprise at their effectiveness. American commanders focused on their sectors and largely ignored Canadian accomplishments. Full recognition came only after weeks of continued Canadian success during the Normandy campaign. Before D-Day, Canadian forces had already proven their capabilities in the Mediterranean. On July 10, 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade landed in Sicily during Operation Husky. Initial resistance was light as Italian coastal units surrendered quickly, but the inland advance proved far more difficult. German forces conducted skilled fighting withdrawals through mountainous terrain. Canadian troops endured extreme heat and treacherous conditions while facing determined defenders. Towns such as Leonfort fell only after 3 days of house-to-house fighting, requiring carefully coordinated attacks supported by artillery. By August 7th, the Axis forces had evacuated Sicily, and Canadian troops emerged from 4 weeks of continuous combat with invaluable lessons in combined arms warfare, mountain fighting, and urban operations. The Italian mainland campaign began on September 3, 1943, when Canadian forces crossed the Strait of Messina and landed at Reggio Calabria. The advance up the peninsula was brutal, moving through mountains, rivers, and heavily defended German positions. The Morrow River crossing in December 1943 claimed 1,400 Canadian lives. Although the river was narrow, German defenders on the north bank controlled all approaches. Infantry attacked across open ground under heavy fire, while engineers constructed bridges under constant shelling. Next came Ortona, a medieval town perched on cliffs overlooking the Adriatic. Narrow streets and sturdy stone buildings made it ideal for defense. German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division held every house, booby-trapped streets, and placed machine guns to cover all approaches. Canadian units, including the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the 4th Highlanders of Canada, supported by tanks from the Three Rivers Regiment, developed new tactics out of necessity. They mouse-holed through buildings, blasting holes in walls to move safely from room to room, reducing exposure to deadly street fire. Tank guns fired at close range to destroy fortified positions. Fighting continued day and night, including Christmas Day 1943, until German forces withdrew on December 28 after 8 days of brutal combat. In total, 1,375 Canadians were killed during the Maro River and Ortona battles. John Keegan later described Ortona as Canada's Stalingrad, comparing the fierce urban fighting to the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. The battle proved that Canadian soldiers could match elite German troops in the toughest conditions. German commanders admitted afterward that they had underestimated Canadian tactical skill and fighting spirit. In May 1944, Canadian forces joined massive Allied offensives to break through the Gustav Line and capture Rome. The 1st Canadian Corps, including both the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 5th Canadian Armored Division, assaulted fortified positions across open ground in the Leary Valley. Supported by massive artillery, tanks, and coordinated infantry attacks, the Canadians overcame German defenses. By May 23, Rome was liberated, with Canadian troops among the first Allied soldiers to enter the city. The Italian campaign cost Canada over 25,000 casualties, including more than 5,800 killed. But it transformed inexperienced soldiers into seasoned veterans. Officers who later led units in Northwest Europe gained invaluable experience in Italy, and soldiers who had landed in Sicily as green recruits emerged battle-hardened. After D-Day, the next major challenge for Canadian troops was Caen, a critical crossroads controlling access to the French interior. German forces, including SS Panzer divisions and the elite 12th SS Hitler Youth Division, were determined to stop the Allies from breaking out of the beachhead. They expected to crush the Canadians with experience and sheer force. Instead, they encountered troops who were equally determined and capable. Canadian divisions fought fiercely, matching the training, tactics, and ferocity of some of Germany's most elite units.
The 12th SS Division was particularly notorious and feared. Composed largely of teenage volunteers, these soldiers had been heavily indoctrinated in Nazi ideology from an early age. They fought with reckless aggression and a brutal disregard for their own safety. On June 7, 1944, elements of the 12th SS Division launched a counterattack against Canadian positions around the towns of Orly and Buren. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers faced an extremely difficult fight. German forces had superior armor, and the Canadians suffered heavy casualties, losing 128 men killed and 89 wounded. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, the Canadian line held. German troops were unable to push the Canadians back to the coast. Even more shocking were reports of atrocities committed by the 12th SS. At Abbaye d'Ardennes, 20 Canadian prisoners were executed, while other wounded soldiers were killed in their positions. These acts of brutality enraged Canadian troops and fundamentally changed their rules of engagement. The fighting around Caen dragged on for weeks, stretching from June well into July. One of the critical objectives during this period was Carpiquet Airfield, which had been a D-Day goal but remained in German hands. In early July, Canadian forces launched Operation Windsor to capture the airfield. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by tanks from the Fort Garry Horse, attacked German positions beginning at 5 a.m. on July 4th. Resistance was fierce and relentless. Every hangar, building, and stretch of runway had been prepared for defense. Canadian infantry advanced under intense machine gun and mortar fire, while tanks engaged German anti-tank positions, suffering losses from hidden 88mm guns.
By evening, the Canadians had taken most of the airfield, but German forces still held the nearby Carpiquet village. The battle continued through July 5th, and by July 6th, the defenders finally withdrew. The airfield was secured, but Canadian casualties had exceeded 400 men. Just days later, on July 8th, Canadian forces joined Operation Charnwood, a major assault on Caen itself. The 2nd Canadian Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, attacked from the west while British forces moved in from the north. The assault was preceded by massive aerial bombardments, with 2,500 tons of bombs dropped on German positions. Canadian infantry and armor advanced into the northern suburbs of Caen, engaging in brutal house-to-house combat that lasted 3 days. Once again, the Canadians employed the mouse-holing tactics first developed at Ortona, blasting holes in walls to move through buildings safely and avoid deadly street fire. By July 9th, Canadian troops controlled northern Caen. Though the city would not be fully liberated until August, the July offensive shattered German defensive lines and opened the way for further Allied breakout operations. The ultimate breakthrough came in August with Operation Totalize, a Canadian-led assault aimed at punching through German positions south of Caen. General Simonds personally oversaw planning, introducing innovative tactics, including night attacks by armored columns guided by radio beacons and tracer rounds. He understood that daylight assaults against prepared German positions caused massive casualties, so attacking under cover of darkness would reduce losses and negate the enemy's advantage. Pathfinder tanks equipped with specialized navigation gear led the armored columns. Radio beacons marked assembly points, while tracer rounds fired at precise intervals guided the troops. On the night of August 7th, over 800 Canadian and Polish tanks and armored vehicles struck the German lines under darkness. The assault achieved complete surprise. German forces, expecting only daylight attacks, were overwhelmed. Anti-tank crews could not target what they could not see. Canadian armored columns smashed through defensive positions, advanced 7 kilometers in 12 hours, and created gaps that infantry quickly exploited. German commanders responded immediately. By August 8th, Tiger tanks from the 1st SS Panzer Corps counterattacked, and the next 3 days saw fierce tank battles across open farmland south of Caen. Canadian and Polish forces fought running engagements against German armor, destroying hundreds of vehicles and demonstrating their ability to conduct large-scale, complex armored operations. Following Totalize, Operation Tractable began on August 14th. This Canadian-planned offensive aimed to close the gap between Canadian and American forces and encircle German units. Canadians attacked in daylight but used smoke screens to obscure German defensive positions. Heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German rear areas, while artillery fired continuously. Canadian infantry and armor pushed south, while American forces advanced north from the opposite direction. By August 16th, Canadian and Polish forces reached the Falaise corridor, narrowing the gap between Allied forces to just a few kilometers. Thousands of German troops attempted to escape through the shrinking corridor, but Allied artillery and air power inflicted devastating casualties. Historians debate whether Montgomery or Bradley could have closed the pocket faster, but the reality is that Canadian and Polish forces fought continuously for 2 weeks under intense pressure, closing the gap as efficiently as possible. The Falaise victory effectively destroyed German combat power in Normandy. Between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Without this decisive action, German forces might have regrouped and prolonged the campaign for months. By the end of August 1944, the Canadian First Army, operating as an independent formation under General Harry Carrar, had repeatedly proven its skill and effectiveness. Their true test, however, came in September and October during the Battle of the Scheldt, arguably the most critical Canadian operation of the war. After the liberation of Paris, Allied forces advanced rapidly across France and Belgium. By early September, British forces captured the Belgian port city of Antwerp, along with its docks intact. Antwerp was Europe's second-largest port and capable of handling massive volumes of supplies. Yet a serious problem remained. The Scheldt estuary, an 80-kilometer stretch of water leading to Antwerp, remained under German control. Until the estuary was cleared, Antwerp could not be used to supply the Allied advance. Montgomery assigned the operation to the Canadian First Army. It was widely seen as grueling, unpleasant work. The terrain was harsh, reclaimed land below sea level, crisscrossed with canals and dikes. Germans had flooded large areas, turning the battlefield into a watery maze. Defensive positions were exceptionally strong. The German 15th Army, commanded by General Gustav Zongen, held the area with experienced troops and terrain perfectly suited for defense. Canadian commanders knew the attack would be costly and demanding. The operation required clearing 4 distinct areas. First was the Breskens Pocket, south of the estuary. Second was the South Beveland Peninsula. Third was Walcheren Island at the mouth of the estuary. Fourth was the area north of Antwerp itself. Each zone presented unique challenges. On October 2nd, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division began the assault on the Breskens Pocket with amphibious landings across the Brockman Inlet. Using Buffalo amphibious vehicles, infantry came ashore under heavy German fire. While the landing succeeded, subsequent operations quickly bogged down in flooded fields and strong German resistance. Every village, dike, and canal crossing required hard, methodical fighting, demanding enormous courage, coordination, and persistence from Canadian troops.
Canadian casualties mounted steadily as the Scheldt campaign dragged on. The terrain was brutal. Flooded fields, canals, and dikes made it nearly impossible for tanks to operate. Infantry had to advance through waist-deep water under constant artillery and mortar fire. The worst day for Canadian forces came on October 13th, when the Black Watch Regiment from Montreal launched an attack on the village of Wendra. This village controlled access to the South Beveland Peninsula, and German forces, including the experienced 6th Parachute Regiment, defended it with determination. The Black Watch crossed open ground under heavy fire, but the attack failed. The regiment suffered 145 casualties, including 56 killed, and 27 more were captured. It was a devastating loss for a single battalion in one day. Despite these setbacks, Canadian forces pressed on. By late October, they had cleared the Breskens Pocket and pushed onto the South Beveland Peninsula. The final phase of the operation was the assault on Walcheren Island. British forces conducted amphibious landings at Westkapelle and Flushing, while Canadian troops attacked across the narrow causeway connecting South Beveland to the island. The causeway assault became legendary in Canadian military history. The causeway itself was only 40 meters wide, elevated above flooded fields on both sides, with no cover whatsoever. German defenders had perfect fields of fire along its entire length. Canadian attacks between October 31st and November 2nd were repeatedly repulsed. The Calgary Highlanders lost nearly an entire company in a single assault. Yet Canadian commanders understood the importance of taking the causeway. It was necessary to draw German attention away from the British amphibious landings. On November 2nd, Canadian and British forces converged on Walcheren from multiple directions. German defenders, now surrounded, saw organized resistance collapse by November 8th. The Battle of the Scheldt had lasted 5 grueling weeks. The Canadian First Army, including British and Polish units, suffered a total of 12,873 casualties. Of these, 6,367 were Canadian. The Canadian 2nd Infantry Division alone lost 3,650 men in 33 days, but the mission succeeded. On November 28th, the first Allied convoy entered Antwerp, led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Katari. Antwerp immediately became the primary supply base for Allied forces advancing into Germany. Without the Scheldt operation, Antwerp would have remained unusable and the Allied advance might have stalled. American historian Charles MacDonald later wrote that the Scheldt operation demonstrated the Canadian Army's ability to plan and execute complex, multi-phase operations in the worst possible terrain against determined opposition. British historian Terry Kopp called it one of the most grueling and significant battles fought by Canadian forces in World War II. The battle proved that Canadian commanders could plan major operations independently, and Canadian soldiers could overcome any challenge through skill, courage, and determination. By early 1945, the Canadian First Army was recognized as one of the premier formations in the Allied order of battle. The final test of Canadian combat power came during the liberation of the Netherlands. After the Scheldt victory, Canadian forces spent the winter of 1944 to 1945 holding defensive positions along the Maas River. For 3 months, from November 8, 1944 to February 8, 1944, Canadians were not engaged in large-scale operations. Rest was desperately needed. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade had been fighting since D-Day. Other units had joined in July. 5 months of continuous combat had left battalions battered and exhausted, with high numbers of killed and wounded. In February 1945, the Allies launched a major offensive to drive German forces back across the Rhine and bring about Germany's final defeat. The Canadian First Army, under General Harry Crerar, was strengthened with additional Allied formations, becoming the largest army ever commanded by a Canadian officer in combat. The army advanced from the Nijmegen salient southeastward to clear the corridor between the Rhine and Maas rivers. Fighting continued through February and March in what became known as the Battle of the Rhineland. The terrain was appalling, yet Canadian forces pressed forward. Historian Dwight Eisenhower later praised the Canadians for conducting attacks under conditions more difficult than almost any other operation of the war. It spoke volumes for their skill, determination, and courage. On March 23, 1945, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, crossing the Rhine River. Canadian engineers played remarkable roles, building Bailey pontoon bridges and floating prefabricated bridges into place under fire. By the end of March, Canadian units had moved north, taking Emmerich on the Rhine's right bank. On April 1st, the 1st Canadian Corps, under Major General Charles Foulkes, replaced the British 1st Corps in the Canadian First Army, giving Crerar direct control of both Canadian corps for the first time since Normandy. After crossing the Rhine, the Canadian First Army received 2 critical tasks: liberate Western Netherlands and advance through northeastern Netherlands and northern Germany towards the Weser River. The Western Netherlands mission was urgent. Dutch civilians had suffered through the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945. In retaliation for a railway workers' strike, the Germans had banned all inland freight movement, preventing food from reaching southern and western population centers. Approximately 18,000 Dutch civilians starved to death, and millions more suffered severe malnutrition in the worst famine in Dutch history. Canadian forces launched liberation operations in early April. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked northeastern Netherlands, liberating towns including Almelo on April 5th, Zutphen on April 8th, Deventer on April 12th, and Groningen on April 16th. The Battle of Groningen involved intense urban combat. Canadian soldiers cleared German defenders house by house and street by street. Despite knowing the war was lost, German forces fought tenaciously. Every street corner was a potential ambush, every building a strong point. Canadian soldiers used experience gained at Ortona and Normandy to methodically reduce German defenses. The liberation of Arnhem occurred between April 12th and April 16th. Arnhem had been the site of a failed British airborne operation during Market Garden in September 1944, which left the British 1st Airborne Division nearly annihilated. This time, Canadian forces, supported by the British 49th Infantry Division and armor from the 5th Canadian Armoured Brigade, took the city in 4 days of coordinated operations. Canadian engineers again displayed remarkable skill, constructing Bailey pontoon bridges under fire and floating prefabricated bridges across the IJssel and Niederrhein rivers, allowing armor to cross faster than the Germans expected. Heavy artillery smokescreens covered the city, masking the true crossing points. Operations of the 1st Canadian Corps in Western Netherlands focused on liberating Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, the 3 areas where Dutch civilians had suffered most during the Hunger Winter. Canadian soldiers worked tirelessly, using combined arms tactics, artillery, engineers, and infantry coordination to bring relief and freedom to the occupied Netherlands.
Canadian forces faced difficult choices during the liberation of the Netherlands. Using massive artillery against German positions would have reduced Canadian casualties, but it also risked killing Dutch civilians living nearby. Canadian commanders deliberately limited artillery use, relying instead on infantry tactics, even though this meant higher casualties for their own troops. Protecting civilians was a top priority. On April 17, 1945, the 1st Canadian Corps liberated the town of Apeldoorn. Among the liberated citizens was a 7-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kalf. A unit of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals stationed in Apeldoorn adopted her as an honorary captain, presenting her with rank insignia and shoulder flashes. Her mother sewed these onto a blue sweater that Elizabeth wore for years, a small but lasting symbol of Canadian care and kindness during the liberation. By April 21st, Canadian forces reached the North Sea, capturing towns such as Zout and Leerdam along the way. The 2nd Canadian Corps then turned east, clearing remaining German forces from towns along the coast, including Emden, Wilhelmshaven, and Oldenburg. On April 28th, German commanders agreed to a truce to allow the delivery of food supplies to starving Dutch civilians behind the Grebbe Line. Canadian and Allied air forces immediately launched Operation Manor and Operation Chowhound, dropping food to the most desperate populations. These mercy missions prevented thousands of additional deaths in the final days before the German surrender. On May 4th, Canadian soldiers received orders to halt all operations, with a ceasefire set for 0800 hours on May 5th. General Folks, commander of the 1st Canadian Corps, formally accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands that day. On May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrendered, officially ending the war in Europe. Soldiers who had fought since Sicily or Normandy could finally rest. Stuart Johns of the Canadian Grenadier Guards recalled the overwhelming relief, but also the sorrow for comrades who had died in the final weeks of the war.
Canadian troops were greeted as heroes throughout the Netherlands. Jubilant crowds filled the streets, showering liberating soldiers with flowers and kisses. Children rode on Sherman tanks, and families embraced Canadian troops. These spontaneous celebrations became known as the sweetest spring, a joyful expression of relief and gratitude after 5 years of brutal German occupation. Canadian troops brought not only freedom, but food, medical aid, and hope to a starving population. The cost was heavy. More than 7,600 Canadian service personnel died during operations in the Netherlands from September 1944 through May 1945. Many soldiers lost their lives even as victory was imminent. Private Harry Brott, for example, was killed by German artillery in Apeldoorn on April 15th, while the same shelling destroyed Dutch civilian Nelly Vandenberg's home. After the war, Nelly wrote to Harry's widow, Ruth Brott, expressing gratitude for his sacrifice. Stories like this created personal bonds between Dutch civilians and Canadian families that have endured for generations. The liberation of the Netherlands forged a lasting friendship between Canada and the Dutch people. Dutch schools teach children about Canadian liberators, and Canadian war cemeteries in the Netherlands, such as the Groesbeck Canadian War Cemetery, are maintained by Dutch volunteers. Each year, on May 4th and 5th, Dutch citizens hold remembrance ceremonies honoring Canadian soldiers. Thousands of Dutch women married Canadian soldiers, becoming war brides and immigrating to Canada. Even during the war, Princess Juliana of the Netherlands took refuge in Canada, and her daughter, Princess Margriet, was born in Ottawa in 1943. The Canadian Parliament declared her hospital room extraterritorial to ensure she retained Dutch citizenship. In gratitude, the Netherlands sends 100,000 tulip bulbs to Canada annually, celebrated each year at the Canadian Tulip Festival in Ottawa. Leadership played a key role in Canadian success. Lieutenant General Guy Simons became one of the finest corps commanders of the war. Innovative, aggressive, and willing to adopt new tactics and technologies, his night armored assault during Operation Totalize shaped armored doctrine for decades. Montgomery, despite his difficult personality, recognized Simon's abilities and granted him operational independence rarely given to Commonwealth commanders. Major General Christopher Vokes, who led the 1st Canadian Infantry Division in Italy, was known for being blunt, tough, and effective. His soldiers respected him because he shared their dangers and ensured they had the support needed to succeed. Individual Canadians displayed extraordinary courage throughout the war. Captain Paul Triquet of the Royal 22nd Regiment earned the Victoria Cross at Casa Berardi in Italy on December 14, 1943. His company had been reduced to 14 men and 4 tanks by heavy fire. Yet he personally led his troops forward, captured the position, and held it against repeated counterattacks for 24 hours. Private Ernest Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders earned the Victoria Cross near the Savio River in Italy on October 21, 1944. Facing 2 German tanks and multiple machine gun positions, he grabbed a Piat anti-tank weapon, destroyed one tank, drove off the other, and single-handedly neutralized enemy machine gun positions. Major John Mahoney of the Westminster Regiment received the Victoria Cross for leading his company across the Mella River under heavy fire on May 24, 1944. Despite being wounded twice, he held the bridgehead against counterattacks for 6 hours. These Victoria Cross recipients represented thousands of Canadian soldiers performing courageous acts in less recognized circumstances. Every division had men who fought with exceptional bravery. The strength of the Canadian Army rested on these individuals, soldiers who refused to accept defeat, even when the odds were against them. Why were Canadian capabilities underestimated initially? Partly because of inexperience. The Canadian Army had not fought a major war since 1918. By 1939, the Army had shrunk to fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. Rebuilding an army from scratch takes years, and Canadian forces spent long periods training before seeing combat. The disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942 reinforced the perception that Canadians were brave but poorly led and underprepared. In reality, the Canadian Army learned from these early setbacks. After Dieppe, Major General John Hamilton Roberts, who commanded at Dieppe, was removed. Training intensified, and tactical doctrine was revised. Soldiers trained extensively with new equipment, focusing on combined arms operations. By the time Canadian forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were a completely different army, well-led, well-trained, and ready for complex operations under difficult conditions. Another factor was prejudice. British and American commanders often viewed Commonwealth forces, particularly Canadian and Australian units, as colonial troops, enthusiastic but less professional. This bias influenced planning decisions, often relegating Canadians to secondary objectives or defensive roles. When Canadian forces proved their abilities in battle, respect gradually replaced prejudice, but recognition was often delayed. Even post-war, Canadian contributions were sometimes downplayed in histories focused on American or British efforts at D-Day or in Italy.
Canadian achievements in World War II were remarkable, yet they often did not receive the recognition they deserved. The evidence, however, is clear. On D-Day, Canadian forces advanced farther inland than any other Allied division. In Italy, they fought through the Gustav Line and the Hitler Line. In Normandy, they helped close the Falaise Gap. At the Scheldt, they opened the port of Antwerp. These were not minor contributions. They were decisive operations that directly affected the course of the war. The capture of Antwerp alone justified the Canadian casualties in the Scheldt campaign. Without Antwerp, Allied logistics would have been crippled during the winter of 1944. German forces understood its importance. The Ardennes offensive, which became the Battle of the Bulge, was aimed in part at recapturing Antwerp. Throughout the war, Canadian troops fought at the same level as elite British and American divisions, and in some operations, they performed even better. This was no accident. It was the result of careful training, strong leadership, innovation, and determination to prove doubters wrong. Statistics tell part of the story. More than 1 million Canadians served in uniform during World War II, out of a population of just 11 million. The Canadian Army sent 5 divisions overseas, along with independent brigades, armored regiments, and support units. Canadians fought continuously from 1940 to 1945. Over 42,000 Canadians died in service, including 22,900 in the Army. For such a small nation, this was extraordinary sacrifice. But numbers alone do not measure capability. True military skill is reflected in battlefield results. On D-Day, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division advanced farther inland than any other Allied division. At Ortona in Italy, Canadian soldiers fought house to house against German paratroopers, securing a key point on the Gustav Line. At Falaise, Canadian forces helped close the gap that trapped the German 7th Army. In the Scheldt, Canadians achieved the mission that opened Antwerp, enabling the Allied push into Germany. Even General Montgomery, initially skeptical of Canadian capabilities, acknowledged their effectiveness after observing them in combat. By late 1944, he considered General Simons one of the finest corps commanders in the Allied armies. Montgomery later wrote that the Canadian Army had learned to fight effectively under his command. While his praise was often self-serving, it recognized that the Canadians had evolved into a highly professional army. What Montgomery did not fully credit was Canadian innovation. They did not merely follow British doctrine, they developed new techniques. Mouse-holing, used at Ortona and later in Normandy, became a standard tactic for urban warfare studied worldwide. Night armored assaults, pioneered by Simons for Operation Totalize, influenced armored tactics for decades. Canadian military engineers set new standards in amphibious operations and river crossings, showing that skill, creativity, and disciplined coordination could overcome the toughest challenges. Canadian capabilities were initially underestimated for several reasons. Inexperience was one. The Canadian Army had not fought a major war since 1918, and by 1939, the Army had fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. Rebuilding a modern army from scratch took time. Early disasters, such as Dieppe in 1942, reinforced perceptions that Canadian soldiers were brave but poorly led and inadequately prepared. Yet those assumptions ignored the lessons learned afterward. Following Dieppe, the Canadian Army conducted a ruthless self-examination, identifying every tactical error, coordination failure, and equipment deficiency. Training was intensified, tactical doctrine revised, and new equipment issued. When Canadian forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were a transformed army, better led, better equipped, and trained in combined arms operations. By D-Day, they were a mature, professional force capable of executing complex operations under the most difficult conditions. Prejudice also played a role. British and American commanders often viewed Commonwealth forces, particularly Canadians and Australians, as enthusiastic but less professional colonial troops. This bias influenced planning, often relegating Canadians to secondary objectives. When Canadian forces proved themselves in combat, respect replaced prejudice, but recognition was often slow and grudging. Even post-war, Canadian achievements were sometimes downplayed in histories written by British or American authors. D-Day narratives focus on Omaha Beach. Italian campaigns highlight British and American operations, leaving Canadian contributions only briefly mentioned. The reality is that Canadian soldiers fought some of the war's toughest battles. Ortona, with its brutal house-to-house fighting, was compared to Stalingrad for intensity. The Scheldt campaign tested troops in some of the hardest terrain in Europe. Falaise was a decisive encirclement operation that shaped the outcome of the Normandy campaign. These operations directly affected the war, yet remain relatively unknown outside Canada. The transformation of the Canadian Army from 1939 to 1945 is remarkable. Canada entered the war with fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. By the end, over 1 million Canadians had served, drawn from every region of the country. The Army fielded 5 full divisions overseas, plus independent brigades, armored regiments, and support formations. Canadians fought continuously from 1940 to 1945. Over 42,000 Canadians died in service, including 22,900 in the Army. For such a small nation, this was extraordinary sacrifice. But numbers alone do not measure capability. True military skill is reflected in battlefield results. On D-Day, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division advanced farther inland than any other Allied division. At Ortona in Italy, Canadian soldiers fought house-to-house against German paratroopers, securing a key point on the Gustav Line. At Falaise, Canadian forces helped close the gap that trapped the German 7th Army. In the Scheldt, Canadians achieved the mission that opened Antwerp, enabling the Allied push into Germany. Even General Montgomery, initially skeptical of Canadian capabilities, acknowledged their effectiveness after observing them in combat. By late 1944, he considered General Simons one of the finest corps commanders in the Allied armies. Montgomery later wrote that the Canadian Army had learned to fight effectively under his command. While his praise was often self-serving, it recognized that the Canadians had evolved into a highly professional army. What Montgomery did not fully credit was Canadian innovation. They did not merely follow British doctrine, they developed new techniques. Mouse-holing, used at Ortona and later in Normandy, became a standard tactic for urban warfare studied worldwide. Night armored assaults, pioneered by Simons for Operation Totalize, influenced armored tactics for decades. Canadian military engineers set new standards in amphibious operations and river crossings, showing that skill, creativity, and disciplined coordination could overcome the toughest challenges. The cost of Canadian achievement was immense. More than 42,000 Canadians died during the war, including nearly 23,000 in the Army, and about 60,000 were wounded. For a population of 11 million, these losses were deeply felt in every community, from Saskatchewan farms to Nova Scotia fishing villages and Ontario cities. Thousands of families were permanently affected by loss. Canadian capability must be measured both by achievement and context. The Canadian Army fought some of the war's toughest battles. Ortona matched Stalingrad in urban combat intensity. The Scheldt campaign tested troops in some of the hardest terrain in Europe. Falaise was a decisive encirclement operation that shaped the outcome of the Normandy campaign. These operations directly affected the war, yet remain relatively unknown outside Canada.
Juno Beach on D-Day had defenses second only to Omaha, making it one of the toughest landing sites faced by the Allies. Canadian forces succeeded despite these challenges, often at heavy cost, but always accomplishing their assigned objectives. Their success came in the face of initial inexperience, prejudice from Allied commanders, and far fewer resources compared to British and American forces. Context is essential when evaluating Canadian performance. Canadian soldiers were mostly volunteers serving far from home. They trained extensively, but most had never faced combat before Sicily or Normandy. They confronted veteran German troops who had fought across multiple fronts. Despite these challenges, Canadian forces consistently matched or exceeded the performance of more experienced Allied units. This demonstrates the effectiveness of their training, the quality of leadership, and the determination of the soldiers themselves. Relations between Canadian forces and Allied command were sometimes tense. Montgomery's patronizing attitude toward Canadian commanders created friction, even as Canadians won victories on the battlefield. American generals largely overlooked Canadian contributions in their post-war memoirs and histories. British military historians often emphasized British and American efforts, minimizing Canadian roles. This historiographical bias means Canadian achievements remain underappreciated outside of Canada, despite their significance. Modern military historians, however, increasingly recognize Canadian contributions. Authors like Terry Kopp and Mark Zulke have documented Canadian operations with detail comparable to studies of American and British forces. Their research demonstrates that Canadian divisions fought as effectively as any Allied formations, sometimes outperforming units with greater experience and resources. Academic recognition has grown, though public awareness remains limited. One of the war's most enduring legacies is the bond between Canada and the Netherlands. No other Allied nation maintains such close ties with a liberated country decades after the war.
Dutch gratitude reflects Canadian sacrifice and the respect Canadian soldiers showed civilians. They shared limited rations with starving populations, provided medical care, and maintained discipline, preventing looting and abuse. These acts created lasting goodwill that went beyond mere military victory. Canadian veterans returned home profoundly changed. Men who left as farm boys or factory workers returned having seen combat's brutality and witnessed the devastation of Europe. Many struggled with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Others turned their wartime experience into careers and community service. Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin exemplified this pattern. Returning to his Ontario community, he served as a school trustee, volunteer, and local leader while working in government and running a small business with his wife. His memoir, written 50 years after D-Day, ensured his generation's experiences would be preserved for future Canadians. The question of Canadian military capability in World War II is answered clearly by the historical record. The Canadian Army consistently achieved success in difficult operations across multiple theaters over 5 years of war. From Sicily to Italy, from Juno Beach to Falaise, from the Scheldt to the liberation of the Netherlands, Canadian forces accomplished every major objective assigned. Despite initial inexperience and skepticism from allies, they innovated tactically, fought tenaciously, and earned respect through battlefield performance rather than reputation or resources. This capability grew from several key factors. 4 years of rigorous training prepared soldiers thoroughly. Lessons from the Dieppe disaster were analyzed and corrected. Leadership evolved from cautious staff officers to bold combat commanders willing to innovate. Soldiers fought with determination, knowing both their nation's reputation and their comrades' lives depended on success. The combination of preparation, learning from failure, strong leadership, and soldier determination created an army capable of matching any in the world despite limited resources and a peacetime military tradition. Canadian military history deserves greater recognition internationally. The Canadian Army's performance in World War II represents a small nation making disproportionate contributions to Allied victory. Canadian divisions fought in some of Europe's most important battles. Canadian sacrifices helped liberate millions from Nazi occupation. Canadian tactical and engineering innovations influenced military methods worldwide. Yet outside Canada, these contributions remain relatively unknown, as post-war narratives emphasized American and British roles while minimizing Commonwealth achievements. On June 6, 1944, Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin led his men ashore at Juno Beach. Allied commanders doubted whether Canadians could succeed where Dieppe had failed catastrophically. By nightfall, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had advanced further inland than any Allied division, secured all objectives, and proved doubters wrong. That pattern repeated throughout the war. Initially underestimated, Canadians repeatedly demonstrated their capabilities, from green divisions in 1939 to combat-proven formations liberating the Netherlands in 1945. By the war's end, the Canadian Army earned its reputation one battle at a time. Every operation, from D-Day to the liberation of the Dutch, highlighted Canadian skill, courage, and innovation. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Your support helps share these forgotten stories of the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with untold histories that shaped our world. Every story matters. Every sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe, uniting veterans, history enthusiasts, and those who honor those who served. Thank you for watching.
And thank you for keeping these stories alive.